Mark Haddock is out. But some say the loyalist informer has been told he's a dead man walking if he tries to return home after being released from prison in England. Haddock was previously the commander of the notorious Mount Vernon UVF gang. A serial killer, he was jailed for 12 years in 2014 after wounding former mate Terry Fairfield, a Catholic from the New Lodge in England. Despite being told he's not welcome at home, reports suggest he would like to come back. Haddock's enemies include not just his loyalist associates, but also Republicans he targeted during his time in the Mount Vernon UVF. Our security correspondent, Allison Morris, joins me.
Hello, good to be back. Haven't been here in a while.
Allison, Mark Haddock is someone who people have been reporting about for years. He's now back out. There are a plethora of reports out there, and we're going to try and make sense of them all. And all of these reports exist because people are very, very interested, not only in Mark Haddock and in what he has done and what he's going to do, and in the Mount Vernon UVF. So I think in sober terms, who is Mark Haddock for anyone who has no idea?
So Mark Haddock was a commander in the Mount Vernon UVF, and during that time the Mount Vernon UVF was involved in dozens of murders. Some of them were of other loyalists and Protestants during feuds, and some of them were just blatantly sectarian killings during a period of the Troubles. Probably the one that many people will stick out in most people's heads is the murder of Ciarán McKenna. Ciarán McKenna was known as the Good Samaritan killing. She was killed in January 1993. She was visiting a Protestant pensioner in North Belfast who she would have called on to bring food and make sure he was okay and he had everything he needed. And she was shot dead by loyalists as she was visiting that man, which is just the most blatantly sectarian. So this is the type of thing they were involved in. It turns out then, after the Mount Vernon UVF, the Raymond McCord Jr. was a member of the UVF. He had then came into conflict with that Mount Vernon unit, and they beat him to death, battered him to death. And he was then, his father, Raymond McCord Sr., who many of you will know, he's a campaigner. He has tirelessly campaigned for justice for his son. He made a police ombudsman complaint, and that's probably when things changed, because at that stage, Nuala Olone was the police ombudsman. She carried out an extensive investigation into Mount Vernon UVF called Operation Ballast, and that showed that this unit of the UVF that was involved in all these murders was riddled with informers, one of them being Mark Haddock.
An informer, a commander, a trigger man, a serial killer, and a drug dealer. He's got it all.
Yeah, look, and because we were in the Troubles and we were in a conflict, and this was a part of the UVF, we give this a sort of paramilitary cloak and a paramilitary guise. But by any other standards in any other part of the world, the Mount Vernon UVF were just a very large organised criminal gang. They were involved in drug dealing, they were involved in extortion, they were involved in robbery, they were involved in dealing in arms, they were also involved in murders, and those murders sometimes were members of their own community who had they had come into conflict with, or they were innocent Catholics who they killed every now and then to keep up the pretense that this was some sort of, battle for loyal Ulster, when in fact it's probably... I have a long history of reporting on the Mount Vernon UVF going back quite some time. And if you remember, there was a supergrass, so-called supergrass trial that involved two brothers, the Stewart brothers, Robert and Ian Stewart. And it was, at the time, one of the biggest trials of its type. It started in 2011, but had been much hyped long before that. And it was involved originally 14 members who were alleged members of Mount Vernon UVF. It dropped to 13 because the case was thrown out no bill against one of them. And Mark Haddock was among the accused in that. And I remember very vividly sitting it was the biggest court, had to be used in Laganside. The defendants, you can imagine if you have 13 defendants, you also then have 13 senior counsel, junior counsel, solicitors. I mean, this was a busy, busy court, huge media interest. The two brothers given evidence. They're the two informants. They had been members of this gang and they came out. But Mark Haddock, even then, was estranged from the rest of the Mount Vernon UVF, because while the rest were in the dock where the defendant said, he had to sit in the body of the court where the legal professionals and journalists would sit, and he was flanked at all times by two armed personal protection officers, because he was already at that stage under serious threat from his fellow associates in the UVF. And the details of that case, it went on for quite some time. I believe it cost something like £20 million, and no one was convicted. One person actually was convicted, but only because there was CCTV of them buying a sledgehammer in a B&Q, which was used to bash in the door of Tommy English, a UDA man who they murdered during the feud. Apart from that, none of them were convicted on the Stewart brothers' evidence, but Mark Haddock was there every day. At the time, he was probably maybe in his early 40s. He looked much older than his years, and you can imagine that kind of life might take its toll on you. He was already living in England at this stage, and he was already under threat. But yeah, I mean, these names, the Mark Haddock, Gary Haggerty, all of the people who were involved in that. We have then people like, I suppose, Willie Young, people who were all names that if you are a reader of, the media, if you're interested in this period within loyalism, if one of your loved ones was affected, clearly you would know. But they are names that are very well known to police, very well known to journalists. And Mark Haddock is someone who is never too far from violence and destruction and prison and police and the media. He's a constant, I suppose. He'll disappear into prison for a while, which is what has happened here, and then he'll come back out, and you just know that he'll not be able to live a quiet life.
If one looks at the latest pictures we have of Mark Haddock, and people can see those on our website, belfasttelegraph.co.uk, he looks older than his age. He's like a haggard character. But nevertheless, this was an extremely dangerous man. He is understood to have personally murdered Ciarán McKenna, a person guilty of no more of being a Catholic and trying to help her Protestant neighbour. And also, he's also understood to have personally murdered loyalist Tommy Shepherd in a pub in Ballymena, blasting him twice in front of stunned drinkers. Tommy Shepherd was a UVF leader in Coleraine and was killed because of his opposition to drug dealing. I mean, this is the character we're talking about.
Yeah, and we're told that during the Tommy Shepherd, there was two people who had arrived to do that killing. One said, "I'm not happy about doing this in this packed bar," and Haddock just went, "Yeah, I don't care," because he knew that nobody would come forward and give evidence against him because of the fear that existed around that time. And that was a very public execution of Tommy Shepherd. As you said, took place in a bar in Ballymena. More recently, we had a trial about the murder of Gary Convey and Eamon Fox, and that was a purely sectarian murder. These were two Catholic workmen who were working on a building site in Tigers Bay. It's alleged that one of their workers, one of their co-workers, was someone who was in fact connected to the UDA, but had said, there's Catholics coming up in the country to work on this site, and the UDA at that stage weren't interested. The information was then passed on to the UVF, who had planned to kill him, and both of those men were murdered. Really hard working, Eamon Fox, real family man. I said again through that trial that involved a different supergrass that at that stage involved Gary Haggerty. Much more believable than the Stewart brothers, who were clearly just liars from day one. But again, the problems with those kind of trials is trying to get an assistant offender is never a reliable witness, because they'll always minimise their role and maximise everybody else's in it. And so at that case, again, no one was convicted of that. But you also got a glimpse into, again, that murderous unit of the Mount Vernon UVF. And I have to say, I found Gary Haggerty's evidence very convincing, but also harrowing when you heard the absolute chaos that went on in that unit, who just did not care. And it really was any Catholic will do type behaviour.
Just to speak about the Mount Vernon UVF, obviously a ruthless group, obviously effective in their own world, because their simple task was to kill Catholics, the more innocent, the better from their twisted point of view. But they were much more than that and much less than that. They literally were the worst of the worst. Described as a bunch of thieves, drug addicts who giggled when details of their activities were laid before the court. These people are totally outside any kind of normality or society.
They were. I mean, that trial, the Tommy English trial, went on for weeks, and at times, when they were talking about killing this man, and Tommy English wasn't an innocent person, he was a member of the UDA, but they were talking about killing him in front of his wife and children, and they were giggling and sniggering, and Darren Moore was among one of the people who was in that at the time. They laughed and joked constantly when the court was in recess. They, shouted abuse at ourselves, at members of the press, when they didn't think that the day before's coverage, that they didn't like that. There was clearly, they didn't believe they were getting convicted. And to be honest with you, after day one, I didn't think they were getting convicted either. Do you know, it always, and I know this is quite a trivial point, but it always sticks in my head because it was Judge Gillen was the trial judge in that, and he allowed us to live tweet from that trial for the first time. And that was the first time in the history, I suppose, of the Northern Ireland judicial system that we were allowed to live report because of the huge public interest in that case. Before that, when I first started journalism and first started court reporting 20 odd years ago, if you even took your phone out of your bag and looked at it in the court, the judge would have had the clerk throw you out. I mean, you weren't allowed any electronic devices. And so that's why too, it always sticks in my head that we were sitting with laptops and phones live tweeting during that trial. It was, a mockery of the justice system. And I suppose one of the things that remains stuck in my head to this day because it was so disturbing was that one of the Stewart brothers, Robert Stewart, had convictions. Among his convictions that were taken into consideration, they were given a much reduced sentence after admitting dozens of crimes, was that he had been abusing girls as young as 13. And they were taking these girls, meeting them on their way to school in their school uniforms, taking them off to parties, filling them full of drink and drugs, and they were being abused. And this was part of his conviction. And one of the defence barristers was challenging him this and going, you're a deeply unpleasant person. You can't be believed. I mean, you've convictions for abusing these children. And he turned around and he looked at the dock where the rest of them were sitting. And I remember he just waved his hand. He went, "Should we were all doing it?" And it put chills down my spine, and I thought, we talk now about grooming gangs, and at that stage that phrase wasn't even something that we'd ever spoke about before. But I thought, my goodness, like when you think about the young women who are now grown women now who are sitting having to deal with that, and the way it was said so flippantly and the way they sniggered and laughed, and that was, I think it summed up that period of that unit of loyalism and what they were actually there for. It was all for self-interest and self-gain, be that financial or anything else. It was, and that's several trials I've sat through where they've painted a picture of that, and it wasn't organised, and at times it was chaotic. At times it was, drunken madness dreamt up in a community hall somewhere where they decided, oh, come on, we'll just go and kill someone. It was completely erratic and under the control of people who were working as informers for the state. And I suppose that's where the remarkable part of this comes, because
And Haddock was an informer.
He was an informer. Haggerty was an informer. The whole unit was riddled full of informers. Neil O'Loan's report, Operation Ballast, remains online. If any of you are into this kind of thing, you can go and read the full report. It's very lengthy and very detailed. It was groundbreaking at the time when it was released. And this is what you were dealing with. So, the problem is, as Neil O'Loan pointed out, at the time she linked him to 10 murders and 5 potential other murders. There's since been linked to about 20 different killings. Some of them not directly, some of them he was just helping organise or he was involved in that murder. But all of this was while he was also being paid by the state and was working for Special Branch.